Welcome back to History 101. My name is Christina Paris. I'm an instructor for this course. And we're going to pick up with the second part of Chapter 18, Industry and Empire, 1890 to 1900. And we're going to pick up with the Cross of Gold speech given by William Jennings Bryan. Now, William Jennings Bryan, for some of you, the name may sound familiar, possibly with the connection that he had with the Scopes monkey trial, which we'll be talking about later on in this course. I don't want to spend any time on that in particular. I want to focus primarily on his connection here and the Cross of Gold speech. The Cross of Gold is responding to the gold standard, which we briefly touched on in the previous lecture. Ultimately, William Jennings Bryan supported the idea of coining more silver, which we also discussed in the previous lecture. The idea that if we produced more silver coinage, that it would stabilize the economy, that it would ultimately bring us out of this depression, this panic of 1893 that we were going through, that it would ultimately turn us around and bring us back from the brink. Well, economic theory, we know that that would have probably made things a lot worse. Of course, at the time, we didn't know all that. So, Bryan is advocating this idea. He's being supported by people that are also following down this similar train of thought. He comes up with this Cross of Gold speech, this impassioned speech, which wins over people with the famous line that he would not be crucified, man will not be crucified on a cross of gold. It's very firebrand, bully pulpit kind of speech that gets people worked up into this fervor that, ultimately gets him nominated by the Democrats and the populists. It wins him the chance to run for president. And ultimately, he goes up against William McKinley in the 1896 election, who were pro-gold. So it brings us to this election of 1896 that comes down to essentially the battle of the standards between gold versus silver. Now, when we get to the election, McKinley hires on this gentleman by the name of Marcus Hanna, who uses these very modern PR techniques. This election ultimately becomes known as the first really modern election because of these techniques that Hanna utilizes. And what techniques am I talking about? I'm talking about the utilization of slogans, the utilization of things such as ditties, these short little songs. You probably are not too familiar with it because by the time we come along, many of us come along, I'm not going to say all of us, maybe there are some of us that are older in this class, but by the time, most of us have come around, we aren't too familiar with some of the older songs, but there are songs out there, usually up until the 60s, maybe the 70s, where there are these catchy little songs that are run in political campaigns where the idea is this little tune gets caught in your head for a political candidate, and you find yourself starting to hum it, and then you remember the little lyrics that go along with it, and you start humming it more and more, and when you get to the polls, you make your decision because you find yourself humming that tune, and you realize that that tune really kind of makes you happy, and it kind of makes you giddy, and you really, That's who you remember because of the catchy little tune. And that's the idea of these catchy little tunes. Think of It's a Small World in Disneyland. How many of us can't, once you hear that tune, can't get that tune out of your head for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks after you hear that tune one time? It's the same principle. The tune is meant to be there. It's meant to stick with you. It's meant to get in your head, invade your thoughts, and never leave your head for a very long time. Same principle. And Hannah came up with these slogans. Hannah came up with these ideas of utilizing these strategies with broadsides, with pins, with buttons, with all these things effectively so that people didn't forget who McKinley was. Whereas Brian stayed tried and true to the old-fashioned way of campaigning. He did what was called stumping. Many of you may have heard of this term before. And what stumping is these impromptu little speeches all around. A candidate still does stumping to some degree, but the stumping that he was doing was much more informal, whereas nowadays these things are planned out. These campaign rallies are very much more structured, much more rigid, whereas the impromptu stumping that Brian was doing was much more off the cuff, much more kind of informal stuff, meet and greet type stuff. Not the way we do most of the campaigning things today. So anyway, very much more of a traditional style. But ultimately, what comes out of this 1896 election is we're going to see a dramatic transformation of our federal government that's going to abandon this idea that Andrew Jackson had set aside of seeing the federal government very minimalized, very small. We're going to see an expansion of the federal government in many capacities moving forward. There's this abandoning the idea of keeping federal government small. So now we're going to move on and talk about the lure of the cities. So we start concentrating on what's going on in the South primarily. And we're going to see Southerners moving to the cities. And this is partially due to the fact that the cities are expanding. We're not seeing that growth in the rural part for a number of reasons. The expansion of the railroads did not happen quite as planned. The concentration of the railroads stayed primarily focused in the cities. We also see that the promise of the sharecropping faltered. If you remember correctly, I talked to you about in previous lectures about the downside of sharecropping. Sharecropping had too much potential for falling into a debt cycle. And that was due to the idea of a crop lien. And the crop lien is this idea of pledging, this concept of pledging a certain amount of your ungrown crop to pay for supplies. So say you didn't have enough money to pay for the supplies you need to grow your crop. So your bill's $175 with your general store. And you know right now the bushels of cotton is going for a certain amount and you're going to have to pledge 25 bushels. You only have enough to pay, say, $100 of that bill, so you agreed to pay the remainder in $75 of that. So you agree to pledge so much of your crop, and you know that your crop is only going to yield, say, 200 bushels, and you're going to have to pledge 25 bushels to make up that difference. Well, over the time that your crop is growing, you lose 50% of your crop. But then the prices of cotton fall. So that original 25% of your crop that you had to pledge, you now may have to pledge 50 or 75% of your crop to pay that same amount. So by the time you get done pledging, paying off the crop lien, you only have a very small percentage of your crop left to actually sell on the market to keep your family fed. But additionally, maybe over that time, that season, you've had to buy additional supplies. So you've gone further in debt. In addition to maybe there's been another calamity. You've lost additional crop. It's a vicious cycle. It's a terribly vicious cycle. Because maybe you'll decide that you're not going to pay off that full crop lien. Usually crop liens were required to be paid in full though. So it becomes a very, very vicious, never-ending cycle, and oftentimes left you continually in debt or with very little money left at the end of the growing season. So that's why people often wanted to get out of the sharecropping. I've actually known a woman whose family made the courageous decision to leave the South and move away so that they could make a better life, because sharecropping was such a vicious cycle, that her father realized that they would never get out of the crop lien system, the debt system and the debt cycle. And it was a heart-rending decision for them to make, because they knew that her father knew that they would have to sell everything to leave, and they did not know what they faced leaving, whether they could make a go of it. So something to think about. But there was jobs and education available for whites and blacks in the cities in the beginning. Moving into following the passage of Plessy versus Ferguson, things will change. Things will shift, because we will see the movement towards segregation, and segregation will change the landscape of city life tremendously. We will see the emergence of the Jim Crow South, and this will change how life is lived in the South, especially stunningly in the Deep South. And that's what we're going to be talking about next, is inventing Jim Crow, and Plessy versus Ferguson. The idea of separate but equal accommodations emerging in the Deep South, and how this accommodation, if you can call it an accommodation, emerges. Because separate but equal doesn't exist in the Jim Crow South. I don't know if any of you have ever seen separate but equal, well, if you could call it separate but equal, which it really isn't equal, accommodations in um, segregated, the segregated South. They're staggering. I've talked about this in brief, but the one that always stands out to me and leaves me shocked is the accommodations of the restrooms at a railroad station. And of course, the white restrooms are right inside the railroad station. You know, indoor plumbing, really nice, lighted, clean, beautiful. And then you wonder, you're looking around and you're going, these are clearly white. They've got the big sign there, white for whites only. You're wondering, where are they? Where are the accommodations? Then they show you where the accommodations for the, I hate using this term, colored passengers are. Yeah, they've got accommodations all right. They're outside on the opposite side of the tracks. And you have to realize this is in the deep south. So this railroad station is butted up against a swampy area. So there's marshes and all sorts of nasty, yucky, horrible areas. And this is one of those areas where it's got a swampland right behind this railway station. So they've got this nice little outhouse area. I shouldn't say nice little outhouse area, which has a gap about probably this high all the way around the outhouse and no lighting. Now, maybe some of you are going, okay, that should be okay during the daytime. Are there lights? Nope. No lights. This is an outhouse, folks. So this is essentially a hole in the ground with a board over the hole. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the nice critters that live in the South. There are things such as water moccasins. Now, maybe you are or are not familiar with what a water moccasin is. It's a snake, a poisonous snake, very poisonous snake. They are attracted to any moisture, any water, including and especially outhouses. So you've got this nice big gap all the way around the bottom of this thing, which is a perfect way for a water moccasin to get in. Now, I take a look at this thing and I'm sorry, but if I were a passenger and I had my choice between outhouse or big bank of bushes over where I could see clearly, I'd take the bushes. Because at least I could see, especially at night, where I at least have the advantage of moonlight. Because these outhouses have a roof over them. So there's no moonlight that could get in. At least the bush, you can see. I'd take a bush. I'm sorry. I'd take the risk. Because I want to see if there's a water moccasin. Those things are poisonous. I'm not going to die just because I need to relieve myself. But, that's me. And I'm sure there were many people that made that choice in desperation because, that's a risky thing. But to think that these were considered equal accommodations, that's the shocking thing to consider. all seriousness here, that these were considered equal accommodations. This outhouse with this gap, an outhouse, and yet there's plumbing, these plumbed, beautiful, clean, huge bathrooms inside. Were considered separate but equal accommodations. Now, I'd understand if there were two banks of outhouses out here and one said white and the other said, the opposite. But nope. Sure weren't. That's the way things were in the Deep South. And there are plenty of examples of this. This is, with Plessy versus Ferguson, this was the codification of segregation into law. This allowed for the division of where an African American could go and where he or she could not go. And this lasted for almost 70 years in our country. And if you violated that, if you were an African American and you decided, I don't care, I'm going to go in that white bathroom, I don't care, I'm going to go in that white theater. Yeah, well, let's just say the consequences were dire. If you were lucky, you got thrown in jail. If you weren't, you were lynched. It's hard for us to understand that. We see racism today and we think it's bad. Can't even imagine living with the fear of lynching. So with that, we also see the competition for jobs, migration to cities, and scientific racism coming into play. The competition for jobs starts at this point as well, and this is going to start in a new level of hatred and discrimination. Because all of a sudden there's going to be quotas for jobs. There's only going to be hiring so many people. First in the South and then in the North. It's going to work. We're also going to see the emergence of, this is of course de jure segregation. There's two distinct types of segregation. Because we're going to realize there's something that we don't often realize, folks. There's two forms of segregation going on. Because we often hear about the segregation back in the Deep South. That's called de facto, or I should say de jure segregation, which is segregation by law. In other words, it's codified by law. But there's also something called de facto segregation. Some of you may have heard about this, and some of you may not have heard about this. Now, this is segregation by fact. I know that sounds horrible. But this is segregation that happened in many of our local cities out here, especially in California. You may have heard of South Colton. You may have heard of North Redlands. You may have heard of the west side of San Bernardino. And you may go, yeah, I've heard about them, but what? I really haven't heard much about them. What? You will always hear that the freeway was a dividing line. You'll be like, what's the dividing line? What does that mean? It means that the freeway served as a kind of a division between the communities. It came to stand as that barrier between two communities, essentially, where you had usually predominantly Hispanic American community on one side and predominantly white community on the other side. I encourage you to talk to your families and find out about the stories, because it's often something we don't appreciate, we don't talk about anymore. I grew up playing with my friends that lived on the north side of Redlands, and even into the 1980s there were certain undercurrents that still ran deep in Redlands. And it wasn't until I got much older that I realized the full scope of what it meant to be on the north side of Redlands and why their families made sure that they were back on the right side of the freeway by dark. It had never made any sense to me until I got older and I understood. And then it left me stunned, to say the least, horrified, to say the least, saddened. So I encourage you to talk to your families and to hear their stories, because it's very likely that many of you probably have never heard the stories, or if you have, the full impact hasn't hit you. So I encourage you to talk and listen. There's also the threat of lynching, which we just talked about. And lynching is something that I don't think we realize the full magnitude of the fear of lynching. A few years ago, I had the experience of having a student in my classroom that he moved here from the Deep South before the civil rights movement had taken care of all the problems. And he spoke of the experience of why his family moved from the Deep South. He said that what prompted him to finally move to Southern California was one of his neighbors had been dragged out of their house and the father had been lynched. And he said it's something you don't forget. You never get that image out of your mind. That was a chilling thing, but you don't realize the magnitude of what lynching was like. Something I encourage you to do if you have a chance is to look up, and this may be a shocking thing for you, lynching postcards online. I know you're going to look at me and you're going to go, Professor, why would I want to look up lynching postcards? I encourage you to do this because I want you to see what lynching really was in the South during this time. Because so many of us, I think, have in our minds that lynching was done under the cover of darkness by people in hoods, with only a few people around. And lynching really was not carried out like this. Lynching was done as a public affair. It often was almost I don't want to say this, almost a celebratory activity. It's haunting. And the fact that there were postcards generated and sold of these acts is shocking. There are so many of these postcards out there that people even went so far as to record the details of why these people were lynched. One that stands out to me in particular is of a gentleman who was lynched simply because it was a case of he happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. There had been a young white girl who had been murdered, and this poor man happened to be that had been lynched happened to be on a country road when this posse fell upon him. And since it was presumed that the last witness had seen a black man with the little girl, and it was presumed that the black man who'd been seen with the little girl was her murderer, and this black man happened to be on this country road near where this little girl lived, that he was her killer, he was taken into custody, presumed guilty, and lynched. You're sitting there and you're going, whoa, he may not have even been her killer. It could have been someone totally different that harmed her. But simply because he happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time with a mob that was whipped up into a fury over the death of this little girl, who it's not even clear if she may have been murdered, because there was not even any clear evidence that or indication that she may have been murdered. They just presumed everything, he may have been killed. Literally taken out himself and murdered by this mob because he just happened to be walking down the wrong country road that day. It's shocking. It's absolutely shocking how many miscarriages of justice there may have been. But that's what happened. Now, Ida Wells Barnett was one of the early pioneers who would eventually work with the NAACP. And she tried to make a move towards getting anti-lynching legislation passed. But obviously, she was a woman that was well ahead of her time. Well ahead of her time in trying to make any strides. I mean, even to this day, we still struggle with the issue of lynching. As tragic as it sounds, we still struggle. Then we have the Atlanta Compromise. A concept that was pushed through by Booker T. Washington. Now, Booker T. Washington was the founder of the Tuskegee Institute, the famous Tuskegee Institute, and he advanced the idea of racial accommodation. Now, we're going to talk later on about what was so significant of racial accommodation. But what made it so different in its precepts was the idea that progress was really a struggle. And African Americans should fight for economic success rather than social equality. Essentially, this idea of fighting against this inequality was doing more harm than it was fixing. And that you should really work as a united hand. He used the analogy of a hand, that you should work as one with the whites, that you shouldn't struggle against them, that you should work with them. Well, obviously, this was playing into the hand of the planters. And this idea of accommodation, was it practical at the time? On some levels, yes. But on other levels, it was playing to what the planters wanted to hear. That the African American was going to go, yes, master, and go right back to being the, unfortunately to put it this way, the happy slave. It was doing, on some levels, it was doing more harm to the cause of the freedmen than it was helping. So, racial accommodation had its downsides, and we'll be talking about a gentleman who steps forward and actually challenges this idea, W.E.B. Du Bois, in a minute, or in the next lecture as well, and how he challenged this idea posed by Booker T. Washington. So, disenfranchisement and the decline of popular politics. So, Southern states disenfranchised African Americans and poor whites. They really did not want them to vote. They wanted to make sure that these two groups stayed out of the political sphere. They ultimately wanted to keep them as far away from politics. Segregation ultimately played into this as a form of modern race relations. And participation fell also in the North and West. We see the decline in political pageantry and partisanship. So we're beginning to see a trend of this slow slide down in participation in the political sphere. We're going to see more of this happen as time progresses. This slipping away, this sloughing off of political participation. We're going to see the only participation coming from the highly educated sector, from people of certain social classes from now on, because this is the movement towards a more modern group of individuals, a more schooled group of individuals, so to say. There's going to be this emphasis on advertising, education, and fundraising, as I mentioned, the education angle. So ultimately, organized labor retreats from politics. We're going to see a migration away of organized labor, moving away from politics. They're going to move towards their goals being in economic terms. However, trade craft unions had shared their values and they excluded unskilled workers. We're going to see industrial unions such as the Eugene Debs and the American Railway Union and the United Mine Workers emerge during this era as well. So with that, we're going to break off with the second part and head into the third part.